Okay.
Hi guys, welcome to the Chatbot conference. And today I'm meeting with Greg Bennet, who's a UX specialist at Salesforce. Greg, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Stefan. I'm Greg. I lead our conversation design practice at Salesforce. I am the company's first conversation designer, and its conversation design department is actually very new. So I'm super excited to be working in this capacity. My academic background and training is in linguistics, specifically in interactional sociolinguistics and how language gets used in conversation in practice. And so I like to leverage that training to give a very strong foundation to my work in terms of how we can craft conversation that adheres to what users expect out of conversational behavior. Its structure, its cadence, its flow, all of those things. And then take those linguistic insights and then transform them into design tools. So given certain patterns and behaviors that we know about conversation from linguistics, then we should maybe set the bot response delay at this length, or maybe we should, use this type of phrasing in the conversation design. And so that's really my approach overall to the space.
Got it. So I really want to go down that path further with you.
Sure.
And what it means. So whenever I've built bots, I've always looked at it from a psychological point of view.
Yeah.
Because that happens to be my background. And
Awesome.
what that means is, like, as I'm building out a flow, imagine the welcome flow or a happy flow of some kind.
Yeah.
With each message, I'm always thinking about what the user's thinking and feeling in that moment.
Yep.
And those two things are very real. And then what words are coming across their mind as a result.
Yeah.
Right? Words, feelings, and so on. When you do the same thing with linguistics, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think for me, it starts with what we in conversation analysis and linguistics call sort of the core structure or core unit of conversation. And that's called an adjacency pair. An adjacency pair essentially is the term to describe when one person takes a turn in the conversation and then another person takes a turn in response. Conversation is fundamentally a turn-taking structure. If only one person is talking, it's not a conversation, it's a monologue. And so the way that relevance gets constructed in conversation is through the concept of nextness in that adjacency pair. I say one thing and then you say something next. And every time we say something in conversation, there's something that we're doing with what we say. I think a lot of focus gets put on topic in conversation, which I think is certainly important to kind of constrain the domain of the conversation itself. However, every time I say something in conversation, I'm doing something. It's a collaboration that moves the conversation forward. So for example, right now, what I'm doing is explaining or some kind of action around telling. That is going to constrain the sort of finite set of appropriate next responses in the conversation. So let's say I take one turn and I ask a question. Asking is the action that I'm doing there.
Right.
The sort of finite set of appropriate next responses would be answering the question, or like maybe asking for more information, something like that. But offering a complimenting me is not within that finite set of appropriate next responses. And so that's where the conversation starts to break, in which case then you need to repair it. And so taking that very concrete unit of, okay, adjacency pairs, I say one thing, and if I'm the bot, then the bot says one thing, and then the user says something else. Given what the bot says, if it's an introduction, what do we expect out of conversational behavior to logically come next? What is within that sort of finite set of appropriate next responses? And so I would say that's the fundamental structure of conversation that I draw from in conversation design. I think when it comes to conversational style, things like personality, like you had mentioned, happy.
Yeah.
Like if I want the bot to come across as happy or involved or excited or enthusiastic, then that's when I start to draw more from work on conversational style, which is the flagship work of a sociolinguist named Deborah Tannen.
Mhm.
And essentially what Professor Tannen found in her work is two main conversational styles or ways of speaking.
Okay.
Conversational style isn't necessarily something that's super special. It's just how we talk.
Mhm.
And there's one called high involvement and one called high considerateness. High involvement is characterized by people who take very short pauses, if any pauses, when
Uh-huh.
they talk. They have a very fast rate of speech. They maybe ask a lot of personal questions, and they expect overlap in the conversation. So when I'm talking, you might be talking at the same time as me. That's high involvement. Whereas high considerateness is a person who believes that only one voice should be heard at a time in the conversation. So I'm talking and then I leave a pause, a space for you to talk. But if you start to talk while I'm talking, someone is going to have to stop in order for one person to finish what they're saying. They maybe take a slightly longer pause in conversation and their rate of speech is somewhat slower compared to high involvement. All that said is if I want the bot to be enthusiastic, I'm going to recruit from what I know is a high involvement style instead of a high considerateness style. So I might do something like use emojis to convey that extra sort of affective feeling, or I might include exclamation points instead of a period at the end of a text in the chat. I might use more images. I might shorten the bot response delay between turns. All of those things would indicate a high involved style, which very much can be related to enthusiasm.
I see. And so overall, in terms of like style and design, you would recommend more of a high involvement style.
I think it depends on who your user is. So what Dr. Tannen found also in her work was that people tend to prefer styles that are very much alike to their own.
Right.
So if you can sort of understand about your user base and understand, okay, who's my target user, who's my target market, and discern what kind of style they exhibit, then that's the style that you should probably go after. Now, that said, I think that it's important to sort of reconcile the conversational style with the brand of whatever organization for which you are producing a chatbot. So let's say that you are, trying to create a chatbot for a luxury design like fashion company, fashion house.
Okay.
And so it's very buttoned up. It's very kind of tight and elegant, and that's sort of the brand personality. But you know that your population, your user population, is more high involvement conversational style. They might come from a certain part of the United States, or they might be of a certain demographic. Any kind of these indicators in how they speak and engage themselves online that show that they're very enthusiastic in how they have conversation. Trying to reconcile those two would probably look a little different in that, well, you don't want to send a ton of emojis and a ton of exclamation points through the chatbot if you know that the brand on the website is something that's very crisp and clean and sort of a little more buttoned up. In that case, then maybe you would express the high involvement or the excited, conversational style through, asking more personal questions about the user. Like rather than just saying, is there anything else that I can do to help you? You might ask them like, well, what do you think of our new clothing line? What are your thoughts on that? Trying to understand more about the user and their opinions, their beliefs, their thoughts and feelings. That's something that would show involvement in the conversation, or shortening the response delay to something like maybe 1 second or half a second, where it gives a little bit more of that like fast pace, but isn't overwhelming and doesn't stray too far from the brand identity.
I see. So what you're telling me right now is very exciting.
Awesome.
So when it comes to bots, if the bot could mirror you in some way, it'll obviously communicate with you better, the same way we naturally start to mirror each other when we're in sync.
Yes, precisely.
What's the best way for a bot to extract those behaviors so it knows what to mirror? And how do you do that in a platform or in a conversation? Or like, like how does it raise a flag? Like if they use an
Yep.
emoji, okay, we give them like slightly varied response.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, you're getting in on the answer there, I think. I mean, I think first of all, the technology around that sort of conversational style detection hasn't been fully built out yet. So when I used to work for Microsoft on the Cortana product, I did do a paper with some other researchers about detecting conversational style and trying to operationalize, okay, what are some things that we would kind of look for to detect that? And I think you keyed into one of them, emoji use. One big piece would be the time that elapses between turns of the conversation. So if the user on the other side, responds to the chatbot in less than a second versus maybe another user might respond to the chatbot in 4, 5, 6, 7 seconds, then you start to get a sense of, okay, this one might be slightly more involved. I think another one would be, if I'm going to use a fancy linguistic term, it would be reduplication.
Okay.
That's a really big, long word just to mean like you have repeating characters in what you see on the screen. So like if you use 10 exclamation points, or sometimes if someone's asking a question, to give it that tone of being incredulous, you might have 2 question marks or 3 or 4 question marks. But seeing that reduplication of characters, I think also is indicative of a more involved style as well. And so kind of, I think what would sort of be necessary there is to train a model to then detect that.
Got it. Yeah. So this touches on one of the parts about bots that excites me most. And
Yeah.
that's using bots as a way to learn about the user's personality and their psychometrics.
Yeah.
And what you were saying, like in terms of how involved their style is, it seems like it matches closely with how agreeable or disagreeable you are.
Okay.
So if someone's highly agreeable, they're going to be more prone to being very polite.
Okay.
And that in a conversation, they're going to wait their turn. They're going to not make sure that they don't, step on anyone's foot, and they want to make sure that that the moment is as peaceful as it can be, and they don't want to disturb, rock the waters at all. Whereas someone disagreeable is more interested in telling you a hard truth that might disturb you.
All right.
Than making you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to the concepts of agreeable and disagreeable, I would say that given sort of what I understand from Deborah Tannen's work and across all of interactional sociolinguistics, is that it's all relative. So for example, for a high involvement person, it would probably be agreeable to them for the other person in the conversation to, what we call in the chatbot industry, barge in. Like I kind of, I bristle a little bit when I hear the term barge in. I know that that's something that comes from, like existing frameworks in the customer service industry. But barge in implies that the other person on the side is trying to make a power move in the interaction, that they're trying to sort of take the conversational floor. And for high involvement speakers, that may not necessarily be the case. If they're talking at the same time, it could just be that they're trying to show the enthusiasm for the conversation itself. And that they believe that if you're truly having a sort of lively conversation, then we're all just talking at the same time as each other. And that might be seen as agreeable. Whereas for someone who is high considerateness, it is kind of like what you had explained, where it's agreeable for them such that you're not talking at the same time as me, and only one voice should be heard at once in the conversation. So I think it's relative, yeah.
Okay. So with the other parameters psychometrically, sometimes I wonder, like, what would be the best way to learn about the user without necessarily ask them a question in terms of their behavior, right? And what you described, I think, is a really great proxy to kind of understand one of those parameters. And I'm wondering if there's other great proxies for the other parameters, like extroversion, openness or creativity, neuroticism. um,
Yeah,
conscientiousness. Like,
sure.
and the reason why I think this is important is because once you understand how a person thinks themselves and the type of images that come across their mind,
Uh-huh.
and you can communicate in those images, you could mirror them perfectly almost.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that I find really exciting about linguistics is that all of the data are they're very tangibly encoded in front of you. As soon as you see that chat transcript or that transcript of a voice call, your evidence are right there in front of your eyes. You can actually point to the part of the transcript where the user is, or the user or the participant or the person who's speaking is doing something to convey that mirroring. I think very naturally, even in conversation, like we would, if you put a high involvement speaker together and a high considerateness speaker together in conversation, you might see something where they actually get further apart from each other, because if the high involvement speaker believes that a proper conversation or a lively conversation, an enjoyable conversation, is one where everyone's talking at the same time, they're going to dial up their ways of speaking in order to elicit that out of the other participant. Same with the high considerateness speaker. They're going to essentially give the high involvement speaker more space to talk, because their perception is that the high involvement speaker is trying to make a grab for the conversational floor. And so what happens is the high involvement speaker just ends up talking more and more and more and more, and the high considerateness speaker ends up talking less and less and less, and the both of them end up really frustrated. And so I think that in terms of like figuring out how to mirror that, what is interesting is then if we know these discrete sort of patterns of language use are attributed to these types of conversational styles, then we can see it in the transcript and say, okay, all right, we can see that the pause lengths are super short. We can see that they're asking a bunch of questions, that they have the reduplication of letters or characters or punctuation. We can see that they use a lot of emoji use. And that tells us more that they are correlating to this high involvement style. Now let's sort of mirror that back to them. I think in terms of like trying to sort of correlate those to personality traits, like I think you had mentioned openness. I'm not as familiar with the sort of relationship between psychology and linguistics on that side, just because my focus in sociolinguistics was more on the relationship between sort of like sociology, where sociology and linguistics overlap.
Yeah.
But I think maybe there might be something, it could be possible there's something in the field of psycholinguistics that could maybe answer that question a little bit better.
Yeah, I'm sure there is. And like high openness people, and you'll know when you meet someone that's high in openness, is
Mhm.
because what they're going to want to do with you when it comes to conversation is they're going to want to jump in the deep end of some kind of
Okay.
intellectual topic,
Oh, okay.
right? So high openness is like the creativity
Yeah.
trait, and it falls into two categories. One
Hmm.
of them is like aesthetically driven, so like artists, performing artists,
Okay.
musicians, they fall into that
Uh-huh.
performing art piece of it, and then the
Yeah.
intellectuals fall into the intellectual piece of it. So someone like a Steve Jobs
Ah, right.
would be extremely high in openness, right? So
Yeah.
and I think a lot of this is the reason why a lot of people that are high in openness, they don't like
Hmm.
small talk, they just want deep talk about a topic
Yeah.
that really, really like interests them. And
Yeah.
whenever they meet you for the first time, they're going to talk a little bit, and then they're going to see if they can talk about these 3 or 4 topics that fascinate them. And if
Yeah.
not, then the conversation kind of like fizzles out.
And I think what's really interesting about what you brought up is I think the important intersection between topic and action in conversation. Like I see them both as like one side of the conversational coin. Like you have topic on one side and action on the other.
Yeah.
For as much as inherently everything we say in conversation is doing something, we're moving the conversation forward. It's also kind of hard, I think, if you are moving the conversation forward, if you're kind of all over the map topically. That makes it, I think,
Yeah.
somewhat more difficult to follow. Now, that said, high involvement speakers from Deborah Tannen's research are known to hop from topic to topic more quickly or more frequently within a single conversation than high considerateness speakers. But I think that trying to think through that sort of that interface between topic and action says a lot to me. Like what you had said about chit chat or small talk.
Yeah.
That to me also, I find, again, I think about it as, I think it's probably relative, where small talk for me might be a little different than small talk for Steve Jobs. Maybe for Steve Jobs, small talk is talking about some sort of intellectual book or theory or concept. Whereas for me, maybe small talk is, talking about, I don't know, a movie or the weather or something like that. I think that it's going to maybe be relative. And then maybe what would be interesting to see is, does a particular person's conversational style shift a little bit depending on who the other speaker is and what type of thing they're doing with the conversation?
Mm-hmm. Right. I really like that way of thinking about it, between the difference between topics and then the conversation itself, as two different points.
Yeah.
When it comes to chatbots or
Mm-hmm.
virtual assistants, what has you most excited?
I think for me, it's the sort of advent of these natural language technologies. So, like we were talking about earlier, how would we operationalize conversational style within conversation? For a chatbot, for example. I
Mhm.
think now we're sort of starting to see the convergence between computational linguistics and the sort of more pragmatic sociolinguistic side of the field, where it's not enough just to be able to understand the syntactic and the structure or the semantic meaning behind a particular utterance. Now we're also starting to kind of trace that back to the overall relationship at hand and the interaction at hand. So I think, like, in terms of what excites me most about bots, I think it's the possibility to actually try and operationalize at a computational level these behavioral things that we've seen qualitatively in these other fields of linguistics.
Mhm. Yeah, for me, it's similar. It's the psychology of uh,
Yeah.
applying the psychology in bots. And with AI systems, they say, like, one of the problems when you give an AI system a goal is that,
Hmm.
like, let's say I told Google Home that I wanted pizza,
Hmm.
or I wanted the cheapest pizza, right? It
Uh-huh.
might take that one parameter, like Stefan wants the cheapest pizza, and order me pizza from, like, India or something, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. It's a bad example, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah,
It might just take
I
that one
think,
parameter and say,
yeah, like the ambiguity.
right, because there's ambiguity, right? But maybe what I mean is that I want the cheapest pizza within the next hour here in San Francisco.
Yeah.
So I think that as these systems evolve, like, the only way to really take goals seriously is by having all of the users' preferences.
Hmm.
So when I say I want cheap pizza, then it'll know that, it's in San Francisco, and that I also like an Italian style of pizza, for example,
Yeah.
right? And if it knows all my preferences and knows my personality, it could even predict that I'll like this pizza over that one and make a better decision.
Right. And I think that also extends to how you go about explaining and soliciting all of that in conversation, right? Like some of it could just be as much as you put it into the interface as you're, starting up with the bot or the assistant, where you kind of like fill out a survey or something.
Mhm.
Or, if and I think it depends again on the goal of the interaction. Like if the goal is to really try and strengthen that rapport between the system and the user, then maybe you do try to solicit that information conversationally, where it's like almost kind of like, not necessarily small talk, but like just getting to know each other, where you ask the user, hey, like, what kind of pizza do you like? And you could frame it maybe like as a fun get to know each other game,
Right.
but the system is learning. And I think to add on to that, also, you also learn a lot about how the user is communicating. Like one thing that you had mentioned, when we talked about ambiguity, it also struck me the idea of indirectness,
Mhm.
right? Like you could say, I want a pizza, or you could say, I'm hungry.
Yes.
And if I say I'm hungry, that might imply or indirectly be asking, I want to order food. But unless you know my conversational style, it's not necessarily going to register. And so I think it's really important to kind of factor that in as well.
Mhm. What would be like a good example of that?
Indirectness?
Yeah.
Yeah, it might be something like, so I think like Alexa and Google Home have the ability to kind of connect to your other appliances. And so if you want to, say, change the temperature of your living space, you can do that through a voice interaction. Let's say that I say to Alexa, it's cold in here.
Okay.
If we're thinking about the semantic meaning of that sentence, it's just a statement. Like I'm just sort of describing the state of the world around me.
Yes.
But if we're thinking about what it's possibly doing from an action perspective in conversation, the action within the dialogue, let's say if we're going to use chatbot terms, would be that I'm making a request.
Mhm.
I'm essentially like, why? Because if we're thinking about it, I guess from a meaning perspective, why would I say it's cold in here? I mean, it's interesting because it's so funny because I'm like starting to analyze this on the fly too. But the idea that if I'm talking to another human,
Mhm.
if I say it's cold in here, I wouldn't say that unless I wanted to convey to the other person that, essentially like there's something about the temperature that is worth calling out. What I think complicates it is that in this particular case, one of the participants is a machine, and the machine cannot feel cold. That it can only detect what the temperature is. And so, while with maybe a human might be able to recognize, okay, all right, this person is essentially implying like we should do something about the temperature.
Mhm.
Um, with a system, there's no way for it to kind of know that through like it's sort of like physical touch. It can't feel the temperature. It can only sort of register whatever the temperature value is in the system. And so I think then in order for the system to basically scale to understand indirectness, we would have to teach it, I think, a lot more training data that show that type of interaction, that, hey, all of these kinds of statements,
Mhm.
while they are not requests,
Mhm.
can function as requests.
Mhm. Yeah. Uh, one of the examples I like is asking Google Home or Siri if you need an umbrella or a coat.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because I don't know if you need one, but I was
Yeah.
asking about the weather indirectly.
Right. And I think like there's some, so getting back to the idea of adjacency pairs, I think there's also this sort of like, if I said this thing in conversation, that must mean there may be some sort of predication there.
Mhm.
Like I would only need an umbrella if it's raining. But I find it really interesting because my mom, she is from the Philippines, and in the Philippines, even if it's not raining, they might use the umbrella like as a parasol, because it's super hot and sunny, and so you want to protect yourself from the
Yeah,
sun. So if we only train,
yeah,
let's say, the voice assistant to understand, do I need an umbrella today as indicative of is it raining, then it
right.
might be complicated for users who have that cultural context, who might say, do I need an umbrella today, to mean is it super hot and sunny outside?
Yeah,
So I think all of it is, again, very relative.
yeah. That's a fun one. Um,
Yeah.
when you think about the space like chatbots, AI, voice, what's your 30,000 foot view of the space?
Yeah, I think for me, it's really, and again, if you couldn't tell over my discussion so far, I'm really obsessed with the operationalizing of natural conversation,
Mhm.
whatever we want to define that as. But I really do think that natural conversation is my 30,000 foot view of the space. I think all of us, whether we're working for corporations or nonprofits or academic institutions, anyone who's working on the conversation space, that could be, AI research, NLP, very sort of manual based chatbots to fully automated voice assistants. I think all of us are really in the end game of trying to replicate or produce or scale a natural conversation. And I think a lot of that is very much led by what we see in popular media. And this dates back, I think, I want to say hundreds, if not thousands of years. Um, I forget her name. I know her last name is Bilal.
Okay.
Is a researcher who essentially did a tracing of how all of these narratives around sort of the humanoid sort of intelligence system goes back all the way, I think, to ancient Greece or ancient Rome,
Mhm.
whereby we've always wanted some sort of machine to do human-like things, or we think of ourselves as sort of the ultimate epitome of knowledge, and therefore machines should also be able to adhere to this. And I think that natural conversation or conversational ability is something that we as humans very inherently think of as a defining human characteristic. It's something that separates us from basically every other, species in the world. The way that we have conversation. And so, if we are going to build machines in our likeness that can do human like things, then teaching it to have conversation is sort of like the ultimate goal, because it's such a defining human characteristic, a human behavior. And I think if that's our end game, then every angle that we're all taking, whether it's psychology or anthropology or linguistics, sociolinguistics, sociology,
Uh-huh.
we all are taking sort of a different lens on it, but we're all kind of working towards the same thing. How do we make this interaction feel more natural? And the thing that I find really exciting.
Hey, Greg. So you cut off
Hi.
there for a second.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, it's okay though. So to kind of summarize it,
Yeah.
the 30,000 foot view is that we're essentially um, externalizing this part of ourselves, the conversational part, and we're
Yeah.
and in some way, since it's going to be digitalized, it's going to be more. Uh, I don't want to say powerful, but in essence, more powerful than any one of us at some point. It's going to surpass us because it's drawing on psychology, it's drawing on all these different sort of disciplines. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily like self-aware or something like this, but it's just able to produce hypotheses and test them on scale, something we can't do.
Or I think like what comes to mind for me, again, this is probably because of my training in linguistics, is that I would I would expect to see some sort of variation in the language. So language itself changes over time very naturally, and it's something that is sort of constrained by how we as people use language. And if we introduce machines to the mix, whereby they become conversationally competent, then I would expect some sort of, what I think would be very interesting is some sort of language shift or language change that comes as a result of that. I think we've seen a little bit of it in chat when it comes, and certainly now with chatbots,
Yeah.
when we think about text-based search. So, for example, I have found in my own user research at Salesforce that many users will engage with a chatbot, and instead of taking a full sort of discursive turn that we might take when we're chatting with someone who's a human, they might just type in a couple words, like it's a search bar, like
Yeah.
return item.
Right.
You would never say that to a person, like, hi, how can I help you today? Return item. That's not how we talk. But that is maybe how the conversation design might look for a search interaction or a search bar. And so I think like that is like kind of like the tip of the iceberg. I think about other examples where, at other companies, they've had these conversational agents where they start to kind of maybe invent their own language. And the researchers who are observing the interaction between these machines get a little freaked out because they're like, I don't understand this. So I'd be very curious to see, and very much would expect to see some kind of language variation as a result of conversational virtual agents becoming conversationally competent.
That's very interesting because when I talk to bots, like this is my primary use case that I like to see. And that
Yeah.
is, when I surf the internet or when I go online, there's maybe like 3 reasons why I do it, right? The
Yeah.
first one is entertainment.
Okay. Yeah.
The other ones are like, I want to find something out. So I have a search or a certain piece of information that I'm curious about that I want to get an answer to.
Yep.
Another is I'm looking to buy a certain product and I'm just searching for that product or a certain service, right? And
Yep.
when I go to someone's website, I no longer want to read any of those pages. If there's
Yeah.
a bot, I'm just going to go to the bot and I'll ask him like, can you do X or
Yeah.
what's the price? And I do that where I, instead of making a proper sentence, I'll say cost because I know that one word is going to trigger it.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then how does that eventually, like, I think it's kind of reciprocal in the sense that as we have, children and younger users who grow up as native users of this technology, I wonder to what extent that might also have some sort of reflexive impact on how we communicate with each other, whereby, we've got a generation of users who maybe don't think it's weird or in any way unusual
Mhm.
to say, coffee and expect the other person to completely understand that. But maybe as a result of their sort of experience growing up with these machines and having conversation in this way, maybe that is their new norm.
And it's kind of funny, but don't little children talk this way? Like if they want coffee or they want a donut or a candy,
Huh.
candy, candy.
I think, yeah, I mean, I have to admit, like, I only studied a little bit of first language acquisition and child language acquisition, but like what you're saying sounds very familiar. Like if I'm thinking about like my little cousin who's a baby, they might say something like that in order to indicate an object of some kind. Um,
Uh-huh.
yeah, that's super interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So at Salesforce, you guys are doing a lot of stuff with bots.
Yep.
What areas are you guys focused on, and what areas do you see like the biggest growth in?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest growth right now, from my perspective at least, is in conversation design because it's something that's totally new to Salesforce and it's something that
Okay.
we're really pushing open for the first time and
Mhm.
at scale.
Right.
So Salesforce's primary conversational platform is the Einstein Bot Builder, which is a text-based chatbot builder
Mhm.
for our customer service industry within the Service Cloud product. And the thing that I find very interesting from both a research and a design perspective about the chatbot, the Einstein Bot Builder,
Mhm.
is that rather than building bots ourselves, we are building a tool for people to build bots for their customers. And I very much am of the opinion that and belief that the tools that we provide them are 100% what is going to set them up for success.
Mhm.
And so if they are, let's say, a Salesforce administrator who is used to just setting up, existing Salesforce capacities, like, okay, I'm going to make my record pages and page layouts, etc.,
Mhm.
are then suddenly, sort of tasked with having to build a chatbot for the first time, they're thrown into the deep end of conversation design. And they maybe sometimes don't even know it. Like I've heard a lot of stories about how users sort of fall into conversation design because they just had to build a chatbot. And as they're writing out the dialogues, they're like, well, what should the bot say? Or, oh, this, dialogue sort of fell apart here. What should I do? And that's the part where I think the proliferation of conversation design really, really comes into a crucial part of play. I think users and organizations are starting to realize that the conversational experience, it can fundamentally make or break the interaction with the customer.
Mhm.
Like if the bot, for example, can't call an object from the Salesforce platform or can't respond to some sort of like basic conversational interaction, like if the user says thank you and the bot says I'm sorry, I just don't understand, because the intent around thank you and you're welcome hasn't been trained. I think all of those things, they erode trust with the user. And at Salesforce, trust is our number one value. We really want to make sure that our customers can develop that type of trusting relationship with their customers. And so I think in order to do that, that's where conversation design comes in. So we've already started releasing existing workshops and worksheet data whereby they can create their planning for things like voice and tone and menu design.
Mhm.
We've integrated some very fundamental principles around conversation design into the bot builder itself. The one that I'm the most proud of is the bot response delay.
Mhm.
So in the Einstein Bot Builder, within setup, there is it's a small button or a small checkbox, but I think it's so powerful where you can have the delay whereby the bot, when the bot is taking a pause to respond in conversation, you can have it set to a default of 1.2 seconds, or you can, uncheck the default box and then set it up to 3 seconds. And that came from field research that we did at Salesforce, where we saw in customer service centers in Manila, where they were having conversations with users in the United States, that the pauses that they took in the conversation actually were a lot longer than what we would see in spoken conversation.
Okay.
So in spoken discourse, research has shown that for American English, that the pause might be anywhere from 200 milliseconds to a full second, and anything around a second or longer is preferred. But that's for spoken discourse. In typed discourse, what you might get is a little bit more multitasking, or for a customer service context, the user might have to go and fetch an order number or get their credit card or go get something. And so that creates more of a delay. And so as a result, on average, the pauses that users and agents were taking in chat were longer than anything that we had expected. And so that allowed us to kind of say, okay, if the user is talking to a machine that is a chatbot, and we want the chatbot to adhere to the norms of conversation, then we cannot set the response delay at 0 seconds, because there's nothing more fake than when I type hello to a chatbot and it goes, "Hi, how can I help you?" And it just pops back to you with no pause whatsoever. It ends up leaving the user feeling like they've been rushed at best, and then at worst, feeling like they're kind of like talking to something that's artificial.
Right.
So what we did was we said, okay, all right, if the shortest second we saw in the field was 4 seconds long, then we should cut the boundary at 3 seconds, so that way we get at that sort of zone of optimal speed and efficiency, but without being overly sort of unnatural. And then if we wanted to sort of like set our base cadence at 1.2 seconds, that gives us sort of a regular cadence that we can work off of based on that research.
Mhm.
So all of those things, I think, are examples of how we have incorporated linguistics and conversation design into what we do with the Einstein Bot Builder. And for me, that's, I think, probably the biggest growth that I'm the proudest of.
Yeah. I, I, so I've heard this. I've heard of this time delay being this important before, and
Yeah.
the first time I heard it was with Hipmunk. If you remember,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
they used to have a bot for like booking travel, and
Yep.
we're having like a really big trust issue. And
Okay.
when users would say like, I need a San Francisco to New York plane ticket or something
Yeah.
along those lines, the bot would spit out the result right away.
Yes. Yeah.
and, and the users didn't trust it because
Right.
like for what they just didn't trust it. And so Hipmunk,
Yeah.
added like, okay, it's going to take them 3 seconds to read this, and
Yeah.
then we'll add a 1 second delay, so 4 second delay or 3, overall, whatever that number was.
Hmm.
And their numbers just skyrocketed off of having.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's about, I think, very much adhering to that expectation around the cadence of conversation. So again, like nobody, even if it were a human,
Yeah.
it would take them at least 1.2, if not longer, seconds to copy and paste something and hit send. And
Right.
so that's not to say that we're trying to make the bot human, because we're not. We're very clear at Salesforce with our customers, you have to convey to your users that they are talking to and chatting with a machine.
Mhm.
However, it's about trying to adhere to and align ourselves from a design and experience perspective with how users behave in conversation. And the way that they behave in conversation is that they take turns. There's a breath, there's a pause, in which case, in order to give it that shape, in order to give it that cadence, we have to then build in a slight delay.
Got it. And in terms of, because you guys are like a platform, you have a lot of users, and
Mhm.
in my experience, it's been that when people are doing this for the first time,
Yes.
they assume that it's easy because we talk to each other every day, all day long. So,
I couldn't have said it better.
and so there's this presumption of like, of course I know how to make a conversation. And then they go to make
Yeah.
a conversation and, I would say it's more difficult than building an app because
Yeah.
yeah, when you're building an app, all the options are well defined, well known.
Yes.
You can't push the wrong button and go to the
Yeah.
wrong page. But you can ask the wrong question or a question that the bot doesn't answer, right? So
Right.
you have both sides of it. One is like um, building a good bot is hard if you're already experienced and you know what you know or what I know, and
Mhm.
so it's even harder if you don't have that base or that foundation,
Yeah.
right? And then on the other hand, it's going to lead to an enormous amount of failure. So,
Right.
so how do you elevate your users so they build useful conversations?
Yeah. I think part
Hard.
of it is, oh, I might have gotten an echo. Did you say something?
Oh, I say, yeah. And how hard is that?
Oh, yeah. I think part of it is trying to figure out how to meet our users where they are.
Mhm.
So the thing about Salesforce admins is if they don't know something, they're very quick to go to the existing resources in the Salesforce ecosystem in order to get their answer. So they might go to help.salesforce.com. They might go to the Trailblazer community. They might go ask another admin that they know. Or what we found in user research is that oftentimes they might just go to Google and then just type it in, like Salesforce, Einstein bots, and then whatever kind of thing is related to their question. And so the phrase and term conversation design would be completely like new to a Salesforce admin. I don't know that they would even have thought about that differently before, even working with Einstein bots. And so from our perspective, it's important to make sure, how can we inject these insights and these best practices from conversation design everywhere where these admins are going to go based on what we know from user research. So we have conversation design best practices in the help documentation itself. I worked with our content experience team to get those into the documentation. It's in Trailhead, which is Salesforce's online free education platform. And if you take the trail on Einstein bots, you will find a section in there on conversation design. I've done webinars on the admin webinar. I have done blog posts on the salesforce.com blog and the Salesforce UX blog. And that sort of starts to get at that when they type in Google, what should my bot say? Then that's what pops out. And so it's sort of, I think, from my perspective, I kind of took it as a design challenge. Given the way that we know these users interact, how can we make sure that the content is there when they're going to look for it?
Mhm. Yeah, because that's something that I think about, like the way we're building bots now. How is that going to change in the next, 5 years or so, as the technology evolves? And is it going to change to
Yeah,
an extent where, like building a website today will take you like a couple of hours using a tool like
right.
Wix, right?
Hmm.
You do a really good job, and you
Yeah.
have, templates, and you have enough of a mental framework because you're
Hmm.
going to websites for 20 odd years, 30 years, right? Um,
Yeah.
Bots are completely new, but as they're using Einstein or whatever
Hmm.
they're using, are these tools going to become better and better? Of like, okay, well, we're going to make your welcome message. Okay, uh, I see the number one product that you have questions on is the Trump hats that you sell. you know, whatever that product.
Sure.
Um, is that how you guys are thinking about approaching it, or is it like the person that has to think about, okay, what questions are people asking me most? Okay, let me tackle that first. So they
Yeah, I think. Oh, go
value
ahead.
so they get value with their MVP or their first.
Totally. Time to value and scale are very much at the forefront of our minds on Einstein bots, and particularly on conversation design. I
Right.
have talked to several customers who have told me they're like, you must have been, prescient in order to major in linguistics when you did. Like, how did you know this was going to be such a great investment? And I was like, I didn't. When I majored in linguistics, my parents thought I'd be flipping burgers for the rest of my life. I just happened to luck out. But I think the important thing also is that they're like, they don't have the time essentially to go out and get, a master's in linguistics to get up to speed, or, a master's in psychology, or to read tons and tons of books in order to learn all the theory around this. Nor, in my opinion, should they have to. I think it's more about trying to democratize the theory that they need to know in order to be able to do these things. And starting with essentially the actions or the actionable items. So, for example, what you had talked about use cases, that was a big thing when we started out with Einstein bots. And so what I did was I conducted a study of the general population, essentially. So non-Salesforce users, and reasons why they would even engage customer service over chat. And from that, we had thousands of rows of data, and we did an inter-rater reliability test with our data labelers to essentially tease out what were the core use cases for each industry. And once we had that for about 5 of our major industries, we published those findings to all of our users, so that way we could say, hey, all right, so for cable or ISP, your top intent might be this, or for retail, your top intent might be this. And so that way it gives them somewhere to start. And then we do have our partner ecosystem that we also leverage, whereby, people can create templates of bots, and then we can get those out to our users much more easily.
I see. Yeah, that sounds fascinating.
Awesome.
Yeah, like the whole part where it's pre-populated, they have an idea or, a direction to go in with their first build.
Yeah.
What are your biggest design insights? I know you already shared a couple.
Sure.
And
I think, go ahead.
Yeah, your biggest design insights, and then what do you wish you would have known when you first started that you know now?
Sure. I think for my biggest design insights, I would say really are around voice and tone. I think what you had said earlier, and again, I couldn't have said it better myself, where people just assume, oh, well, I can have a conversation successfully, so like I can just do this. Oftentimes what happens is people who think like that will then bake their assumptions and sort of predispositions of language and how conversations should work into the system, and that's only really representative of that particular user and their sort of culture or ecosystem that surrounds them. We learn how to have conversation by interacting with the people around us, and everyone who's around us have a certain sort of set of norms and ideologies about how conversation works. And that might be different than someone from, say, another part of the country, let alone another part of the world. And so I think that that's really a big piece of it, trying to essentially tease apart, okay, what are the sort of cross-cultural patterns of conversation, and how do we convey that sort of style or that voice and tone in the conversational UI? And so if you haven't actively thought through what is my bot's personality or my tone, and come up with a very discrete sort of list or worksheet or plan of how you convey that tone in conversation, then it's going to come across either as confusing or bland or even disengaging. I think in terms of what I wish I knew when I started in the bot space, I think for me, I sort of wish that I had known a little bit more around computational linguistics. Okay. So when I was in school, I studied more of, I would say, the sociolinguistics side of the field, very much kind of straying away from computational linguistics because I found it a little intimidating. And then when I started working on Cortana and then eventually Einstein bots, I found myself, sitting in on classes on computational linguistics, digging into computational linguistic books, because I needed to be able to communicate my ideas in a way that would resonate and land with my data scientists. Okay. So for example, if I walk up in there and I start talking about conversational structure or whatever, but don't relate it to their world in terms of how they could capture this and create a model around it, then
Uh-huh.
it's going to fall on deaf ears. And so I think that, if I could do it over again and I was back in grad school, I would absolutely take a computational linguistics class. Because I think that would give me a little bit more of a sort of stronger foundation starting out. I think now I feel very comfortable to sit down with a data scientist and say, okay, all right, what type of, are we going to use the hidden Markov model? Are we going to use deep learning? Like, what are the advantages of one over the other? How are we going to label the data? All of those things I think I can do now. But in the beginning, it was a little intimidating.
Yeah. That's a subject that I don't have much familiarity with,
Mm-hmm.
computational linguistics. Can you tell me like a little bit more about it?
Sure. I think it's the field of linguistics that's really concerned with sort of the intersection between computers, technology, and language. So I think, like when we talk about things like natural language processing, natural language understanding, all of that I think very much is grounded in the field of computational linguistics. How do we, leverage existing technology or new technology to replicate or create or respond to or recognize or understand language? And so that could be something as simple as an automated speech recognition system where I need to know the difference between fit and sit as
Oh,
words. What as Alexa, I need to know when you're saying one word of the other, and then that's when you draw from the field of, say, acoustic phonetics to then be able to parse apart. Okay, here are all the segments of this sound. Here's why we know it's S instead of F, and therefore this is what overall sort of structure is and what the sentence is trying to say. So I think that's really sort of computational linguistics in a quick nutshell.
got it. And we can end on this piece, and that is,
Okay.
when when companies are starting bot projects for the first time, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's certain things that you would recommend, or and you already talked about them. One of them is time to delivery, getting value out of it as quickly as possible, and so on. How should companies think about these projects in terms of structuring their teams, putting together their teams, who should lead it and drive it, and then
Yeah.
what what's the difference, whether it's an engineer driven, designer driven, or product management driven? What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on all that?
I think, I've always worked in cross-functional teams, and I firmly believe that collaboration is sort of the best way to get the best product out there, because you need that perspective of people from different backgrounds and different training to bring to bear upon the product in order for it to be the most representative for your users and the best that it can be. That said, I think that if you start from an engineering perspective, functionally, it will probably work well. Like, let's say if we're talking about a chatbot, you might be able to, get it on its feet in a very customized way more quickly. But the conversation design, if it's not there, then it's not really going to matter. And I think that your example about Hipmunk was spot on.
Mhm.
Someone needs to be there to provide the design and the user perspective around, okay, here's why we need to build in a bot response delay and why it needs to be this long, because otherwise you might never even think of it. And particularly for engineers, their main objective is what they're trying to do is build the infrastructure. They just want to get it built.
Mhm.
And I think like it's almost like as if you're building a house. You can't build a house with just one person. You need an architect to be the designer for the vision. You need someone who is going to actually do the construction and the building, the engineer. You need someone who's going to kind of like lead and manage the whole product and make sure everyone's going in a similar direction. That's sort of where the PM fits in. So I really think it's a multi-collaborative project. And I think in these times where companies are trying to get up to speed and deliver a bot really quickly,
Yes.
it's important to, I think, recruit from those different disciplines and make it kind of like an all hands on deck from the individual departments to make it truly cross-functional.
Got it. So like a very interdisciplinary team.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
One of the things that we saw, and this was when I was talking with Mira Lynn from GoDaddy, and
Yeah.
what is they actually put their conversational designers on the forefront.
Oh,
Um,
okay, yeah.
and I thought that was interesting because I haven't heard too many companies doing that. And the reason why they do
Okay.
is because there's certain flows that a conversational designer can update right away that will make
Yes.
a difference. That you don't have to like go to the engineers and ask them to, you know, change code or anything like that. So it makes
Right.
them more agile in a way.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think having, and again, it depends on the thing that needs a solution. So, for example, if it's more about the fact that we need to change the wording, or it needs to be able to, um, respond in a different kind of way with the actual conversation and the discourse itself, then that's going to fall more on the conversation designer. If it's more that we see consistently across our entire user base that whenever we get to this particular intent, that it totally fails,
Mhm.
then that seems like it's more of an infrastructure thing. And so maybe that goes to the engineer or whoever the data scientist is, or maybe the conversation designer and the engineer sit together to figure that out. Or if it's something where it's like, it's a bug, where it's like, there's the send button is gone, like I can't deploy anything in the chat composer, that I think would again fall on the engineer. So it really, you need a cross-functional team to be able to tackle all of the
Yeah.
possibilities.
One of my favorite examples from that use case is, you know, when you're looking at like failure, it's much easier to see failure when failure happens at a certain point. Like someone's asking a question, it's not getting answered, or users are coming down a flow and then a huge portion of them drop off, right?
Hmm.
So when they're like situation specific, what I found really interesting is like when you have a design issue that's at the core that runs through the entire design, and
Hmm.
how do you discover that that's your issue? And one of my favorite examples is with the GoDaddy bot.
Yeah.
They changed one word, which changed
Yeah.
everything. You know what that word
Yeah.
was?
What was it?
So they went from I, so the bot talking in first person,
Uh-huh.
the bot talking in second person, we.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So when they went to we, all of a
Yeah.
sudden it changed all of the users'
Yep.
expectations because in their mind they're
Yeah.
no longer like talking to a single entity.
Right. You're talking to the institution.
You're talking to the institution. So it had a huge ramifications. And I'm like,
That's really cool.
right. I'm like, that's amazing that you would catch that even.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it leads me to my next question. So this is the last question.
Okay.
Is if you could had a magic wand and you could
Yep.
make one problem in the space disappear, whether it's through some new future technology or some service,
Mhm.
what would that be? What would you use it
Oh, I mean, if I had a magic wand, I would probably make, um, it's weird for me to phrase it this way, but the lack of conversation repair disappear. I
on?
essentially like, I mean, that's really what I see as the holy grail of conversation. The reason why people sort of perceive themselves to be good at or perfect or skilled at conversation is because we inherently know how to fix a conversation or clarify something when it goes wrong or something is misunderstood. We know how to do that. And that is called conversation repair. You might repeat yourself, you might clarify by saying, no, that's not what I meant, or ask them to say it again. There's all these different cues that show, okay, all right, I'm trying, something isn't quite right here, I'm trying to fix it.
Yeah.
And right now, I think conversational AI really lacks that capability. We can go to a certain degree, but as soon as I ask maybe like a additional clarifying question, that's when the conversation starts to fall apart and you get a sort of critical error with the bot. And so if I could wave my, and it's a hard problem to solve. Conversational repair is complicated. And so, and it's something that we're certainly tackling in our own work at Salesforce. But if I could wave a magic wand and make all of the, like, fast forward to the part where it's like, okay, we did the research, we did the testing, we implemented the solution, and it's done. Yes, I would. That would,
Yeah.
then we could get onto the more advanced things in conversation, like scaling conversational style.
Got it. Well, thanks so much for being a part of this, Greg, and I
My
look
pleasure.
yeah to doing this live someday soon, and hopefully in person after
Yes.
all this has come to pass. So what's the best way for people to follow up with you or learn more about Einstein or to reach out to you?
Yes, the best way to get a hold of me is through email, gbennet at BENNET at salesforce.com. Or hit me up on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn is in/GAB45. And I'm always happy to chat and connect. If you couldn't tell, I'm super nerdy about conversation and linguistics. So I'm
Yeah,
always happy to talk about it.
yeah, me too. Well, yeah, thank you so much for being a
Great.
part of this, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Likewise. Take care.
You too. All right.
Thanks.